Hey everyone, thank you all for coming and being here today. We just want to thank you for sharing your time, your space, your energy in support of Professor Wendy's class and for today's speaker. So this is part one of our speaker series, our Ethnographer Extravaganza by Professor Wendy Smith and Work-Based Learning. Yeah, so like I said, we just want to thank you all for being here today. But before we get to today's event, we just want to take a moment and reflect on the lands we reside on. So we're going to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. So we come from many places and we want to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of the indigenous peoples who have been here. San Diego Mesa College is built on the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay people. We acknowledge and honor their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship, past, present, and future. We also want to honor the legacy of the African diaspora, Black life, and free enslaved labor, which this country was built upon. We acknowledge, protect, and uplift the humanity of our Indigenous and Black sisters and brothers. With this acknowledgement, we want to give honor through our work and continue to stand up for racial and social justice. Thank you, everyone. So I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Andrew Urevlo. I'm a project assistant at Work-Based Learning. And yeah, so just thank you all for listening. And I'm going to pass it back off to Professor Wendy Smith.
Thanks, Andrew. My name is Wendy Smith, and I'm a facilitator for today's event, which is being recorded to share with those who are unable to attend. Please fill out our survey. The link is in the chat. This helps us learn more about our audience and improve what we do. I teach English composition courses with the theme of ethnography and ethnographic writing. I believe it's more important than ever that students immerse themselves in communities, both familiar and unfamiliar. Qualitative research is relevant to life and career, prioritizing lived experience, observational powers, and diverse perspectives. And students bring so much to the table that I always learn from them. Today, we are over the moon to present Dr. Darla Cooper, Executive Director of the RP Group. Dr. Cooper is dedicated to using inquiry, data, and evidence to improve the lives of all community college students. She is currently directing Through the Gate, a research study that examines what happens with students who appear ready to transfer, but do not. Welcome, Darla Cooper.
Thank you, Wendy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here again. It's nice to be asked back. When you're not asked back, that sometimes you just don't know what that means. It could mean a lot of things. So I was going to spend our time together sharing just a little bit about myself, how I got into doing research, and then wanted to spend some time talking about the research that I've done, am doing, and specifically diving in a little bit about some considerations, if not advice, around conducting especially qualitative research, but it would still, some of it would still apply to quantitative research. So again, I am the CEO of a small nonprofit. That's what the RP Group is. We're an independent nonprofit organization that works alongside and within the California Community College system. So we work with a lot of the faculty, the administrators, the state chancellor's office, et cetera. And we do research as when we talk about today. We also do professional development, and we are a membership organization on top of all that for all the people who are institutional researchers and planners in the California Community College system. So before that, I was the director of research for the RP Group, meaning that I kind of headed up all the research projects that we did. And before that, I did work as an institutional researcher at 3 different community colleges. And then before that, I was a counselor, working with primarily students who were on academic probation or were needing to do petitions. So that's a little bit about my background. Again, I started off actually as a counselor and came to research while I was in graduate school, getting my degree in counseling, and learned that I love data. I love research, both quantitative and qualitative. And it was actually an unpaid internship that I was required to do as part of my graduate program that got me into research. And my teacher who taught the internship class made me basically made me go do this internship because when she first said, I need you to go work with the vice president of student affairs on some surveys that she's doing. I'm like, surveys? Ah, that sounds boring. I'm going to be a counselor. Why would I need to do that? And she basically said, just shut up and go do it. She needs help. And I think you'd be good at it. So just go do it. So fine, whatever. So I got into it and I really got into it. And probably a little too into it. But the good thing was she actually offered me a paid graduate assistantship at the end of the unpaid internship. And I definitely needed money at the time. And that ended up, it's a longer story I won't bore you all with, but a few years later, after I had been working as a counselor, she came back to me and said, I'm ready to hire you full time if you are willing. So it turned into a full-time job as where I was actually split between counseling and research. And then again, longer story, you don't all need to know the details, but the bottom line is I ended up deciding that I wanted to shift from counseling to research, and that I also wanted to shift from a university to a community college. I felt that the community college mission was much more aligned with why I got into education, which was to help people, especially first generation students, students of color, women, people from low income backgrounds, all of these things. I thought that if I could help people get their educations, that's because it had helped me, it had helped my family so much. I wanted to help other people benefit from having an education. So I ended up moving to the community college, like I said, and I was a director of institutional research at 3 different colleges before coming to the RP group. So that's more or less the little bit of the background. In terms of the research, I actually started off as a quantitative researcher, meaning the number cruncher, you know, the one who's doing, if you've taken statistics, I was doing that, making charts and tables and writing reports and that kind of thing. And somewhere along the way at the RP group, I can't even trace it, I still can't trace it to figure out, I turned into a qualitative researcher. I mean, I took the classes in my graduate program, so I had the background, I knew how to do the research, but somehow I just started doing focus groups primarily, and people, I guess, liked what I was doing, and people started to request me to do focus groups at their college or with their program in their whatever they were working on. They were asking if I could come and do focus groups. And then before I knew it, I was a qualitative researcher. And that's what I was known for. And statistics, in my opinion, is similar to a foreign language in that if you don't use it, you lose it. And so while the words and the terms sound familiar, and I haven't forgotten all of it because I haven't really done quantitative research in a long time, I'm very rusty. But I said, I hear my quantitative people talking a lot about things, and I can mostly still follow the conversations, but even sometimes I'm going, okay, you guys just went way too far. I don't remember, I don't know what you're talking about. So but what's great about that is that when we do research, we're not doing it for ourselves. We're doing it for other people. We're doing it for the faculty, for the administrators to take that information and make change that will benefit students. That's our motivation. That's why we do the research. And so if we write the findings from the research, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, in a way that, you know, the average person who is not a statistician by trade, if we write it not so that they can understand and then utilize it, then what are we doing? Then we're just doing research for research's sake, which is not why I got into research. I got into research to try to make a difference, to try to inform whether it's the faculty in the classroom, the president of a college, the chancellor of our system, whatever level, you know, department dean, whatever it is. I'm trying to help, you know, inform practice, inform policy, based on what students are telling us, either verbally, like through a focus group, or also through their data. You know, the information that we collect. We collect a lot of information about students, and they're telling us a lot of what they need, what's working and what's not working. And we just need to have people like myself and my team that puts that information in ways that people go, oh, okay, I see what's going on. How can we address this? How can we improve this? How can we remove this? Whatever the data are saying. And so here at the RP group, and I think it might just kind of go back to my background, I'm what you call a mixed method researcher, meaning that I really see the value in both the quantitative, again, the number crunching, and the qualitative, which is the talking to people, hearing, elevating people's voices. And I think that research is so much more powerful when you combine the two, that they inform each other. And you can kind of go, we've done studies that go both ways in terms of sometimes you do a survey first, and with a survey you can, which is usually more quantitative, it can have qualitative elements like an open-ended response. That's a qualitative element. But when you're checking boxes and you're marking agree or disagree and all of those things, it's quantitative. We're counting those and aggregating those responses. But when we ask you an open-ended question, like tell us about this, then that's a qualitative response that a human being has to analyze. Even we have a lot of software that helps us with that, but there still has to be a person that looks at that and says, okay, what does all of this mean? And try to assign value and meaning to that. So anyway, what we often do is sometimes you do a survey first, and obviously with the survey, you can reach a lot more people, right? But you can't go very deep. And you have one chance to ask the question. There's no follow-ups. So however you ask the question, that's what the answer you're going to get, and that's it, right? You combine that. So a lot of times you do the survey and you get answers and you go, oh, I'd really like to dig deeper on this, finding or this question or these answers, whatever it is. And that's when you can often use that information to design a focus group, to dig deeper, to meet with a much smaller group of people, but to kind of say, we got these findings from the survey. What's this about? What was your experience? Tell us more. Let's again, that opportunity to focus in and dig deeper. Sometimes you flip it around and you do the focus groups first because you're not really sure what to ask on the survey. You've got to talk to a smaller group of people, in the group that you're trying to learn more about, and you have that conversation with them. And I said the great thing about focus groups, as opposed to, we always go in with our questions and we have our protocols, but it allows you to have that flexibility and to be nimble so that if something comes up, you can capitalize on that to go like, oh, wait, I didn't know about that. Let's explore this. Or you also have the option of when a student gives you an answer, you can go, can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me what you mean by that? I'm really curious about what you just said. Please say more. You can't do that on a survey. You ask the question, that's the answer, you're done. But in that focus group or an interview, same thing, you're able to kind of ask those follow-up questions to learn more about what the student is sharing. So again, you can use the focus group sometimes to help you narrow down, like, okay, and find out how you might want to ask the questions and what questions you want to ask, and that can help you design the survey. So again, it can go in both, directions where another form of quantitative data is looking at, like, let's say grades, and success rates, or how many students are seeing counselors, or all the different kind of data that we collect. We can look at and analyze that, and then try to figure out, well, why aren't students going to tutoring, for example, right? The data may tell us that, certain groups or certain students aren't utilizing tutoring. Well, you can do a survey. That's one option, obviously, to find out more information about why students may or may not be using a particular service. Or you can do focus groups with students from the group that you, again, want to learn more from, and say, hey, we have this finding, we've noticed this. What do you think? What is your experience? And then you get that context. So that's why we often, and sometimes we use all three, quite frankly, we look at the quantitative data, that enrollment kind of data, the grades, using the service, those numbers. We also do a survey to try to get maybe not as deep, but definitely broad perspective on something. And then we can also do focus groups to dig deeper on narrower focus. So again, it's usually trying to use some combination of those three, at least in our research, to try to tell as complete a picture as we can. I mean, there's obviously limitations, with everything, but you want to, we have these tools available to you, then you want to try to use them as best you can. So a lot of the research, that we've done and what I believe has been shared with you and was mentioned are through the GATE study. We found students who had completed seemingly all or most of their transfer requirements. They had 60 plus transfer units. They were over a 2.0 GPA. They had completed English and math requirements for transfer, but then they didn't transfer. So we wanted to know what was going on with those students. And it was obviously no one simple answer. There were a lot of reasons, not terribly surprising in terms of the number one reason was related to university affordability. And that's a fancy way of saying students didn't know if they could afford to go to the university. They didn't know, because again, it's not just the tuition, right? There's a full cost of attendance. And that's, even if you can look up the tuition and see what that is, but what about books? What if I need childcare? What about transportation? How am I going to pay for housing, food, et cetera? And so they look at that and go, I don't know if I can afford to go to the university, period. Another piece was school life balance, right? Trying to figure out, well, after I transfer, I assume it's a university. Maybe I won't have enough time to do that, plus everything else that I have going on in my life. We all have, different obligations, family obligations, work obligations. How am I going to balance all of that with work? Looking at pathways, helping students navigate the pathways, making sure that they're taking the right courses for their goal, at the right time, in the right sequence, that they're doing all those other things you have to do in order to be able to transfer. And then finally, the students told us about how important it was to have a support network. And obviously that looks different for different students, but in some, it just means are there people in your life, either your family or at the college or friends or wherever in your community, that are helping you in some way meet your goal. So that can be from, the simply encouraging you, like, you can do it, I believe in you, right? To practically sitting down with you and saying, okay, let's look at your university choices. What do you want to transfer in? Let's talk about that. How are we going to afford it? Giving you that really practical advice that you need in order to transfer. And it was the combination of those four factors, and having them or not having them is what, increased students' chances of transfer or decreased it. So we learned a lot from that study. And one of the findings from that study was that if African American students can get past a certain point, right, they are actually the most likely to transfer. So when we looked, for example, at the group of students who had reached the 60 units, right, and then we disaggregated that by race, and we looked at, what does that look like for Black students, for Latino students, Hispanic, for white students, for Asian students, for women, for men, EOPS, students with disabilities. And we looked at a lot of different, categories, but just looking at race, what we found is when you boil it down to, again, that group of students that we were looking at, the ones that had 60 units or more, and we looked at, well, how many of them transferred? African American students were the most likely to have transferred. And so you just kind of go, well, when we typically look at the data for African American students, and we typically measure transfer, like how many people transferred from a freshman cohort. So like of all the people who started in college at this particular time, how many of them transfer within 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, et cetera. And when we look at it that way, and we disaggregate, right? So for the students who are starting fresh as freshmen, and we follow them for some period of time, African American students are not the most likely to transfer. So what is happening between those 2 points, between that freshman point and that 60 units point, to where they go from not being likely to being the most likely? So with that finding, we said we need to look at this more specifically. So we were fortunate enough to get some funding from Lumina Foundation to look at what we call our African American Transfer Tipping Point study. So again, it was just looking at African American students and what factors were helping or hurting their chances of transfer. So this, just to give you some ideas about the kind of work that we do a lot of different kinds of research, but these are at least 2 studies that I've been personally involved in and helped lead for our organization. So I did want to go back to some practical things about conducting focus groups and interviews, right? And because, again, if you're not familiar, focus group means usually there's one facilitator who's meeting with a group. Usually you try to keep it small. 10 is usually a good number, a little more, a little less. And you have a set of questions that you're asking them, and you usually record it, at least an audio recording, if in some cases there may be a video recording. And you just ask people, to respond to these questions. And again, it gives you a chance to ask follow-up questions, to dig deeper, to be able to be flexible in that moment. And so my approach, and it's the same thing with interviews. Interviews tend to be more one-on-one versus a focus group is one facilitator and many participants, whereas an interview is most likely, one facilitator, one interviewee. Sometimes you might have 2 or 3 interviewees, but at a certain point it becomes a focus group than just kind of an interview. But they're usually set up very similarly in terms of you want to have your questions ready ahead of time. One of the things I would say is we write we call them protocols, but it's just the questionnaire. We just have fancy words for things. Anyway, we design these protocols, and what I've noticed is the way that we write questions is very different than the way we speak questions. And so for me personally, you always want to have your questions, but if you try to write them in the way that you speak, you might get stuck, quite frankly. It might just be too hard. So you write them the way that you write them, but most of the time you don't want to go into a focus group and then go, okay, let me read this question word for word to you. Because the thing that you're trying to do is you have very limited time, an hour and a half, maybe, you're lucky 2 hours, and you want people to share personal things with you, their opinions, their experiences. And so you got to get right to it. So if you come across very stiff and very, like, oh, let me read this to you, I'm not sure if that would make me feel very comfortable. So you want to, everyone has to figure out their own style. I happen to be able to look at a protocol, read the question, and then rephrase it on the spot. Because again, it's written in a way that we write. But a lot of times I will look at that and go, so what do you guys think about this? That's not what it says on the piece of paper. It's much more formal on the piece of paper. But because I'm trying to have a conversation, and we don't speak the way we write. We just don't. At least not in English. Unfortunately, I don't speak other languages, so I can't speak to that. But in English, that's why a lot of times you look at a transcript, it's very different than if you had written what was in that transcript. Like, look at the transcript from this session. If I were writing this whole speech out, it would read differently than how I would speak. Think about when you're speaking naturally, you have the stops and the starts and the backup, rephrase, the ums, all of that. You would never write those if you were writing out your speech. So you just want to keep in mind that you want to be prepared, you want to have your questions, but you also want to make it conversational and you want it to feel natural. So you need to put the questions in your own voice and in your own words to some extent, but still get the question, the point of the question across. So like I said, a lot of times I use the protocol, those questions as a guide, but I don't sit there and read them word for word, because again, I'm trying to have a conversation, not, make sure that I read every single word exactly. The other piece is that, again, I mentioned most focus groups or interviews, you have like an hour and a half, and you've got to build trust very quickly because you don't have time. I'm not going to see these people again. I can't come back tomorrow or next week or, 3 more visits or something like that. So I have to create an environment and create a relationship, a trusting relationship very quickly. So a lot of that is kind of what I'm talking about in terms of doing things to make people feel comfortable, make myself feel approachable. Like, for example, I don't usually walk in there and say, hello, I am Dr. Cooper, and I'm here to do this focus group. No, I'm going to come in and go, hi, I'm Darla. So glad you're here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time. And I'm going to be much more, I don't know, what's the word, friendly, welcoming, casual in this. But, I do have a job to do. I'm not trying to say that I don't. But again, I feel like I get more out of it if I treat that person or those people like human beings, and that, I think that's the main thing to remember, that they're not a number, they're not a statistic, they're a human being. And so I often also say, put yourself in their position. If you were across the table, right, or wherever, however you're set up, how would you want someone to approach you? How would you feel if the person was stiff and reading everything and Dr. Cooper and all of that? Would that put you at ease? Would that make you feel like, telling this person, what you really think, what you really feel? Because I often say to the students, it doesn't really do me any good if you lie to me. Nothing's going to change if you don't tell me the truth. So I really want to encourage you to tell me the truth. You have to show them that you care about them, that you care about what they have to say. You can show empathy. I think that's a lot of times there's this, I guess, school of thought that it's all like, distance and all of that. And I'm not saying, I walk away from focus groups and we're all best friends and, or anything like that, but it's trying to build a relationship to let them know, I care. I care about what you have to say. I care about your experiences, and that I'm here to try to make a difference. And that I often will tell students in a focus group that my job is to take what you tell me and to elevate your voice. Because a lot of times, no one asks the students what they think and what they feel. But I'm asking, and I'm listening. I'm really listening to what you're saying. And I will often ask, repeat back to students, for example, and some of this, quite honestly, y'all, comes from counseling. It's counseling that comes in where you repeat back to say, let me see if I'm understanding what you're saying. Let me make sure I have this correct, because I don't want to get this wrong. This is really important. So you're saying blah, 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 blah. That, okay, great. I got it. Great. But it also shows them that you're listening, you're paying attention, and that you are making an effort to truly capture what they're sharing with you. And you're also sharing with them your intention of so I come to this focus group and I give you all this information. What are you going to do with it? You've got to be clear about your intentions. I also am very clear with students about my limitations. A lot of times it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. So I will tell students, a lot of times the colleges will ask me to come in and do a focus group, right? And I tell the students, well, I don't work here. So whatever you say is not going to hurt my feelings. So be honest. Tell me the truth. And then I'm going to take what you tell me and I'm going to tell the college, this is what the students are saying. This is what's working. This is what's not working. These are their ideas for making things better. And also tell them, because I don't work here, I can't actually fix anything. I can't change anything because I don't have that kind of authority. But I will use the influence, if you want to call it that I do have. I mean, they asked me to come in and do this, so I'm hoping that I have their ear. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what you tell me, and that's where how I'm going to use the influence that I have with whoever asked me to come in and do the focus groups. So I really, again, all of this is meant to reassure students, to help them open up, and again, tell me the truth so that I can use that information to help make things better by sharing it with the college and, again, whoever invited me. Empathy goes a long way. I do sometimes, it depends. You got to kind of go with how the flow is, but I will share something personal in a focus group. It's obviously not in the script for me to share that, but something a student says, just to kind of let them know, yeah, me too. Yeah, me too. You're not going to be empathetic on everything. You're not going to relate to everything. But sympathy also goes a long way. And I want to be real clear, because I think a lot of people confuse sympathy with pity. And they're two very different things. Sympathy means I may not have gone through or felt or feel what you feel, but I want to understand, as best I can, as someone who hasn't gone through it. And so there are many times where students are sharing things with me, and I am just moved to say, I'm sorry. I didn't have anything to do with whatever they're sharing, but just to have somebody say, I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm sorry that happened to you. That wasn't right. Or you're right to be confused. You're right to be angry in this situation. Sometimes students just need validation that, it's not them. They're not crazy. Whatever it is, they're not imagining things, that these are real things that are happening and that probably shouldn't have happened. So a lot of times it's sympathy. The other advantage of doing a focus group, it's obviously better in person because you can see body language a lot better than you can, again, in Zoom. You can only see from here up, but you can't see what I'm doing with my hands. If they're below the thing, you can't see, if I'm shifting in my seat, if I, that kind of thing. But I've also, by the way, I have done focus groups in Zoom, and it's an interesting proposition. It's definitely different, but it can be done. And I've done it. But of course, I'm going to prefer in person because observation is also part of the analysis. It's a part of the data. So for example, you might have a student who's sharing something, and and again, if you're just hearing the recording, you're just looking at the transcript, you only hear that one student talking and sharing their experience. But because I'm in the room, I'm looking around while that student's talking, and I can see other students doing like this. And so while there was only one student who said that, I can see that other people agree, that other people had a similar, experience or thought. I can also see if they're going like this. And it means that I might be able to say, okay, that's probably just that student's experience. It doesn't seem to be resonating with the rest of the group. And that's part of the analysis, is trying to take all of that information and figure out, well, what was the general theme of that comes, or general themes rather, that come out of the focus groups. Again, because you are a human being as a researcher and not a robot, you have biases, and they can be positive or negative, and you just need to be aware of them. You need to be aware if you tend to gravitate more towards a certain type of person or student, so that you can self-correct. And again, it can be based on a variety of different characteristics of yours or of the students, or where you might, if you have students that look like you might just kind of naturally say, well, what do you think? And gravitate to that. Again, it's more about not trying to, say, oh, well, I'm biased, I can't do it. It's more about awareness and then mediating that to say, okay, I need to be more aware that I've got to pull out, I've got to make sure that I'm including everyone, and not just gravitating to this type of student or that type of student. I mentioned earlier that I was a counselor, and once a counselor, always a counselor. Took me a while to accept that, that's just a part of who I am, and it will be. But I use it to my advantage in the focus groups. But what ends up happening is sometimes I warn students during the session. I say, you know, you guys, I used to be a counselor, and depending on how this goes, counseling could break out at any moment in this focus group because again, I got into education, you know, as a counselor to help students. And so if I'm in a focus group and I have someone in front of me who is in need, who's clearly in need, whether that's need of information, whether that's need of affirmation, confirmation, encouragement, whatever that is, if I have that, if I'm able to give that, I can't not do it, right? I can't stop. I mean, sometimes I'll be like, okay, hold on, gonna like pause. Sometimes, depending on what it is, I may even pause the recording to tell the student, okay, this is the situation. This is what you need to do. That, you know, or sometimes I'll ask the student, can you talk to me afterwards? Because I want to talk to you about that. And I've done that, you know, several times, depending on the situation. But I feel that when you're doing this kind of research and you're asking people of their time and you're asking them to share, you know, sometimes very personal things, you know, can come up in these focus groups and these interviews. It's not all about me and me getting my research, right? Me getting my data. If the students can get something out of the focus group, I want them to. And I've seen it happen so many different times, so many different ways, but sometimes it is that information. Oh, I didn't know about EOPS. What is this? What is this program what? How do I get into that program? Okay. Again, some of it's time and place, and you have to manage it because the truth is I do still need my data. Let's be clear. I'm here for a reason. I'm here to gather this information. But if there's a way for me to get what I need and you to get what you need, why can't we do that? Right. And so I have, in some cases, backed away a little bit and let students talk to each other because they're asking each other questions. Like, and that literally, that example with EOPS has happened more than once, where one student, we're asking questions, the student says, oh, well, you know, I'm in EOPS and I get to see a counselor and blah, 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 and get book vouchers, da, da, da. And another student says, what? What is EOPS? And so I actually love it when a student explains what EOPS is. Same thing with Emoja, which is a program for African American students. It's at about 70 or so of the 116 colleges. And it's a program that includes counseling, it includes learning communities. There's so much to it to support. It's not just for Black students, it's for any student who is interested and needs that kind of assistance. But I've had that happen as well, where a student talks about being in the Emoja program, or it could be Puente, which is for our Latinx, our Hispanic students. There's all different kinds of programs that are on campuses that students don't know about. And so if they come to my focus group and there's a student that talks about Emoja or EOPS or Puente, and another student says, what? What are you talking about? I sit back, I say, why don't you tell them about Emoja? It's so much better when they tell each other than, I mean, obviously I know what Emoja is, I can talk about it, but that's not the point. It's better if there is a student. But there are times when nobody knows, like I'll mention something and nobody knows what I'm talking about. And I'm like, you don't know about this? Oh, now let me tell you. So then I'm giving them information, not just getting it. And it feels so much more comfortable to me. And again, probably back to my counseling roots, that there's some kind of exchange of information. I've also seen students after a focus group exchanging phone numbers. You know, I've had students, you know, someone perhaps talking about a faculty member, right? And they're saying, oh, you know, I took such faculty member, Wendy Smith, for, you know, English, and she was great, and I did this and that. And so the other student be like, wait, what's her name? What English, what class was that? And they're writing it down. They're taking notes, you know, to figure out, because they need to take that class still. So they want to know which teacher should I take it with, and what a great, you know, reference when, you know, in this situation. So I think that's probably what I really wanted to share about. I will tell you that being, you know, in my current job, again, I'm the the CEO, the chief executive officer for this organization. And it is not in my job description to still do research. But one, I love it. And two, I really feel in particular, being able to do focus groups, even occasionally, is such a privilege. And it helps keep me grounded. It helps keep me connected to students and what they're thinking and feeling and experiencing right now. And I think it's such an important part of our research as an organization. But my ability to go and be in different spaces with policymakers, with faculty, with administrators, and say, no, hold on, I just did a focus group, and I talked to students, and the students told me that. Right. And so I work it in and wherever I can. So again, it's a wonderful experience, a wonderful, again, a privilege for me. I learned so much from students about what works and what doesn't work and what they're dealing with. And I am in great awe and admiration of the students in the California Community College system.
So, Dr. Cooper, we have some questions already.
Okay.
So there's one that we've been kind of going back and forth in the Q&A box. It's from student Bianca Monterosa. Hi, Bianca. She was asking about how you gather quantitative data and what that data is. And we've answered it partially, but she was curious about what it is, what kind of authorization you need to have to gather the data, and how it contributes to the study.
Certainly. I mentioned the example of the survey. So in most cases, I think most of us have taken a survey. You're checking a box, right? You're saying, I agree, or I disagree, or you're rating something on a scale of 1 to 10, or you're checking, your gender, your race, your age, your demographic kinds of things. All of that is quantitative data, because what you do is you add those all up. You say, well, how many people check this box? How many people check that box? And so it's any of those kind of things where you're just kind of adding up and coming up with a number. So you're either saying, like 50% were female, 10% were African American, 2% were students with disabilities, things like that. But it's also things like, well, half the students agreed that they go to office hours on a regular basis, right? So it just depends on whatever the question that you're asking. But you're able to kind of take all of those, checks and marks and selections and quantify them by saying how many or what percentage of students experienced that, agreed with that, use that as a way to describe themselves, again, demographically. So that's one way to do it, is collecting the information kind of directly from the person through a survey that asks those kinds of questions. A lot of the data that we have here that we use is the data that is your college has about you. So it starts with the application. You all remember that. You are checking a lot of boxes. You're filling out information about who you are, where you live, what's your major, why you've come to the community college. There's lots of that. And so all of that information goes into a database that we have, for all of our students. And then once you register for classes, that's more data. So we know how many students are in each class, right, in each section. And then when you get a grade, that's more data. So we know who got an A and who got a B, and we can count that, right? We can say what percentage of students got an A or got a C or higher, what percentage of students dropped a class, things like that. We also have data on who's in EOPS, who is in the Emoja program, who's utilizing those services, who goes to tutoring, what did they go to tutoring for? So there's data being collected at the college for a lot of what you do, not everything, but a lot of what you do. Whether you have financial aid, that's in a database. What financial aid? So there's all of that information are kept in databases, and that we're able to run aggregated data, to paint a picture of how many students are receiving financial aid? What kind of financial aid? How many students are in EOPS? Again, there's so many things that we collect. And then obviously on the back end of that is graduation. Who got a degree? Who got a certificate? Who transferred to a university? All of that information as well are in databases. So hopefully that answered that question, probably more than you wanted to know.
I was excited about your answer. I want to know more. Sherilyn Wilson, it looks like you've had your hand up for a while. Did you have a question? I wasn't sure. Well, we can wait on that. We also have a question from Taylor Hammond, who asks, do you approach research as a sociologist or scientist? Moreover, do you recommend objective observation or strategic experimentation?
Okay. Me personally, if those are my two choices, I'm definitely more of a social scientist than a scientist, if you want to call that. My background, my undergraduate degree is in psychology. I'm a fan of sociology, and so I come at it more, and I have a background in counseling, so I'm definitely coming at it more from that perspective. But I am also a statistician, which is the science piece, which is using statistics to analyze data. So I think my tendency is probably more towards the sociologist and looking at people and how they think and feel and act. But I also, again, what I mentioned, I probably am the mixed method researcher because I'm trying to combine both. Because I think there's so much more. You can have the like the qualitative piece, the focus groups, and that's great. But again, you've only talked to a few people about a very narrow topic. Whereas when you're looking at the quantitative data, you have information about a much larger group of people, but it's not terribly deep. But you put the two together, and it's so much more powerful than either are alone. And as far as recommending, and I'm just going to give you my personal opinion. So I'm putting my disclaimer out front. If there's a human being involved, you cannot be objective. There's no such thing as 100% objectivity. You can try. You can definitely, do things to kind of mitigate your subjectivity, so to make it as objective as possible. But there's all kinds of research that shows just by observing something, you affect it. Even if you don't say a word, even if you don't do anything, you're still, there's actually even science about electrons being observed. And anyway, I won't go into that. But I would say I would not necessarily recommend one over the other, because the answer is it depends. I think in certain situations, one might fit better, one might meet your goals better than another. There's certain times, there's also limitations on funding, timing, other kinds of resources that might dictate. So for example, focus groups cost more money, because that's a lot of time, that it takes to prepare for, to execute, and then to analyze the data, because you have to sit there and read through a transcript and do coding, and it's a lot more complicated. So it can be much more resource intensive than a survey that can be programmed. It can be an online survey, and it can literally spit out the results for you. It's not quite that simple, but it's so much easier than trying to analyze a recording, a transcript of a focus group. So again, depending on your goals, depending on your resources, everybody hates the "it depends" answer, but this is truly the truth about what is needed and what you can accommodate in a particular circumstance. And I said, and most of the time, sometimes you have to compromise. That's definitely, happens, but that's why we try to approach our research with a combination of the two.
Thank you. We have another question, and this time I encourage you to follow along in the Q&A because the question is fairly long.
Yeah.
Is student data, this is from Debbie Emery Flores, is
Mhm.
student data at the class level that is collected via online quizzes and surveys for formative and summative information also under FERPA when it will only be used to inform instructors and program leaders to improve the class and program? None of the data is personal but general about the class.
Yes, basically. At least if I understand the way that the question being asked, is it protected by FERPA? And the answer in general is yes. Um, and again, this is so funny. When I was a counselor, I had to be an expert on FERPA. And but since I haven't been a counselor for a while, I'm not the expert that I used to be on it. But for the most part, if you're collecting data for research purposes, for educational purposes, um, you have a right to see that data. But there's certain information that you, depending on your job, you don't have a right to see, or you only have a right to see it anonymized to where you could not trace it back to the student to identify them. But I said there, for the most part, when you're dealing with aggregated data and you're looking at, again, for the purposes of improvement, then people can access the data. It's more about, FERPA is more about sharing data that you have. So for example, and this had happened to me when I worked on a campus, a teacher might come to me and say, well, I want to know everybody's ethnicity in my class. Why? Why do you need to know that to teach your class? Now, on the back end, you may get results that break down your students' grades by ethnicity, but again, you're getting it aggregated, so it's not assigned, so you're not tying the two together. So you have the grades, but you don't have the race. But the student's race is obviously in the database, if they, filled out, if they answered that question on the application. And so you're able to, when you're kind of crunching the numbers, you're aggregating the data, you can give that faculty member a report that says, how did students do in your class by race, by gender, by students with disabilities, by all the different pieces of information. But a lot of times what's driven, what FERPA drives is whether you have a real job related reason to have access to that student's personal data. So hopefully that answers the question.
I think it did, and it resonated for me because, I was doing humanizing online learning, and I started giving my students a survey at the beginning of the semester, and I just realized that I have 6 classes worth of data on my students now, like whether they work more than 20 hours a week, what some of their biggest obstacles are, what some of their hopes for the course are, whether they care for a loved one at home. Um, and I can look at all of that, and I have the names attached. But like you said, if it's just for my own improvement, fine. But let's say I wanted to share it at a conference. If I didn't, yeah, I would
Well,
have to have their written permission, right? They'd have to sign
well,
something.
I think again, if you reported it in an aggregate form,
Mhm.
then you're probably fine because
Like
at
if
that
I
point,
said 20% of 150 students have to care for a loved one, that
yeah,
would be okay.
that would be fine.
Yeah,
But where you start to get into trouble is if you wanted to share your actual data file with the name
right.
with someone else, like another faculty member or
Mm,
a counselor, or your dean or your department chair. That's when it's like, oh, hold on, hold on. That's where it gets in. But again, if you're even like I said, if you wanted to share results, um, aggregated, right, where you've added them all together and you're calculating a percentage, that's fine. That's because again, FERPA is more about protecting individual students' data, not necessarily collectively. And again, there are other, it's a longer conversation than we have time for in terms of there are some precautions that you should take even when aggregating data if you start to disaggregate it and to the point where the student does become identifiable because they were the only one who was female and African American and over 50 and whatever it is, and there's one person and you can probably look and figure out who that is. So that's where it starts. When you start to disaggregate, that's when it gets a little tricky. But if you're not doing a lot of disaggregation, then you're probably okay. But I would say it's better off, and again, for you, Wendy, not so much for the students, it's better for you to check with your researcher um, to make sure that you're safe.
That's a good idea. And thanks for answering that. And thanks for asking that question, Debbie. I thought that was really good.
That's a great question.
Yeah. It looks like we're about out of time. And I'm so glad you came and talked to us again. This was so interesting to me. And I want to thank everyone who attended today. To remind you also to fill out the summary. Our next ethnographer speaker event is next Wednesday, April 5th. No, that's in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from today, April 5th at 3 o'clock with Kimberly Dark. This is Troy Smith Productions signing off with a bit of a crush, actually. Hope everyone has a happy Wednesday and spring break.
Thank you, everyone.